welcome Professor Timothy Walker from the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth, that is going to present a communication on the Azores as a crossroads for early modern medical knowledge acquisition and practices, circa 1682 to 1825. Evidence from the Hospital Real Militar da Nossa Senhora da Boa Hora in Terceira, Azores. Professor Timothy Walker is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth, where he serves on the executive board of the Center for Portuguese Studies and Culture, and is graduate faculty of the Department of Portuguese. Walker is also an affiliated researcher of the Centro de História da Acã e Além-Mar, da Universidade Nova de Lisboa, em Portugal. From 1994 to 2003, he was a visiting professor at Universidade Aberta, Open University, in Lisbon. He is the recipient of a Fulbright Dissertation Fellowship to Portugal and fellowships from the Portuguese Camões Institute, the Anglo-American Development Foundation, and the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you. 15 minutes to 20 minutes.
All set.
Thank you.
Yes. Can you hear me? Very good. Right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And I want to especially thank the organizers and the people who are promoting and organizing this venue. It's a pleasure to be here. I was here 2 years ago, and we loved it so much, and the experience is great. And what I've been seeing in the papers this morning places the Azores Islands in many ways, literary, historical, strategic, right in the center of the Atlantic world. And I want to continue that, let's see if this will work, yes. I want to continue that contextualization, but in a different way. So I'm a maritime historian. I look at the early modern world, the age of sail and ships, but I'm also a historian of the circulation of medical knowledge and medicine from various places within the Portuguese world. And I wanted to remind us, that because of the natural world, the currents and the winds that prevail in the Atlantic Ocean, the Azores are right at a key important strategic point, that in the age of sail, the Azores were of extraordinary importance as a central crossroads in the North Atlantic. And so sailing ships returning from anywhere in the Portuguese world, whether it be the Americas, North or South, the Caribbean, from South America, from Africa, making trips from Asia, many of them passed right through the Azores, in part because they were beholden to the winds and the currents that carried them there. And I'll give you just a couple of really quick examples that are famous. Christopher Columbus's first voyage returns through the Azores and ends up in Lisbon. And I almost included a picture of us 2 years ago at the site, here in Santa Maria. Similarly, Vasco da Gama's first voyage goes through the Azores, where he lost his brother there and returns to Lisbon. But there are practical, physical, natural reasons why this happens with sailing ships. But the implications for these winds and currents for medicine are important, because we're talking about a period of time where one of the major drivers of the Portuguese overseas expansion was to interact with and contact and learn from and profit from medicines that are coming from different parts of the world. And so what we see gathering in the Azores as a crossroads of travel is also a crossroads of medical knowledge that becomes embedded in the culture, not just here, but anywhere in the Portuguese world, but it's particularly used in the Azores Islands. I put this up here, I use this with my students to give them the wow factor of just how broad Portuguese exploration was. But the last line is what I'd like to draw your attention to. The Portuguese overseas empire is more diverse than any other geographically, demographically, culturally, and bioecologically. And so the medical dimension of drawing medicinal plants and other kinds of substances from every continent on which the Portuguese touch has a way of then finding accumulation in the Azores archipelago. And a final geographically contextual, this is the world, the maritime world that the Portuguese claimed in the 16th and 17th centuries. Mare clausum, closed seas, the principle that it was the Portuguese who had the legal right to assert authority over all this area, but the Azores were the key final northernmost place through which most ships and voyages passed. So here they are, the Western Isles, as they're known sometimes in English and in North America. Ecologically and environmentally, they're a very good place to grow plants from different parts of the world. And plants that don't thrive in other parts of Europe or North America can survive and be grown in the Azores. And finally, I wanted to put up two other maps. This is from Russell Wood's classic book called A World on the Move, and it shows trade routes through the Portuguese world. And then one more from an earlier book from '72, Bentley Duncan's work on the Atlantic Islands, in which the Azores emerge as a key crossroads and nexus. So this is the illustration from Itinerário, Jan Huygen van Linschoten's work, 1596, published in Amsterdam. If you're not familiar with him, he's kind of a Dutch, sometimes we call him a spy, but he was working in the Portuguese world and made observations about how the Portuguese were controlling their Estado de India, the Eastern Empire. And as he comes back, he spends several months in Terceira, and then publishes a book about it in 1596 and really opens the eyes of much of Europe to what the Portuguese presence in Asia looks like. And he was very interested in the medical culture that the Portuguese had developed. Now, Terceira, of course, had been, like everything else in the Portuguese world, controlled for 60 years by the Spanish. And during that time, they created some of the largest fortifications outside of Europe in the Azores Islands. This is Mont Brazil in Terceira. And why did they do that? They did it because it was such an important strategic crossroads. It was a place where the treasure fleets from the Americas would stop over to pick up water and provisions. It was a place that needed to be fortified to guard the transatlantic convoys that were coming from the Spanish world. But it was an important place then also where the gathering of medical knowledge happens. Here's a guy that I dearly miss. That's from 2009 when I was here. Yeah, I'd like to see him again. But I'm posing there with this massive tome. This is in the archive of Terceira, which of course was the capital of the Azores. It was from where the Azores were administered in the period up until 1762, the end of the 7 Years' War. But this is the regimento of the fortress from 1642 to 1720. And as you read through some of those pages, you find documentation about the medical facilities that they maintained in the fortress to take care of the health, not only of the garrison of troops that were there, but also the ships that passed through. And that was kind of my key to get into some of the documentation that's held in Terceira. So what you have there, let's get rid of this picture because it's, there we go, this is much better. This is the hospital as it looked more or less at the time that I was there. It's since been restored. But yeah, it looks much nicer now. So here it is, more modern picture of it. It's not a huge place, but it's just outside the walls of the fortress. And it functioned from 1642 until apparently 1943 as an infirmary, as a place of medical care. But it's also a place where if you look at the records of the hospital, and you have despesas, you have the expenses that the hospital spent money on, you have information in the archives in Terceira about methods that physicians were using to treat soldiers and sailors in Terceira, the documentation is not very rich and it's spotty chronologically, but you can get a sense for the kind of medicines that they were employing. And what struck me is that this is medicine from all over the world. Now, I won't say that the Azores are absolutely unique in this regard, because if you were to go into an infirmary or a pharmacy in Salvador de Bahia or Lisbon or Macau or Goa or any major city within the Portuguese world, by the mid-17th century, you would find a real mix, a hybridization of indigenous medicines from all over the Portuguese world. But what strikes me about Terceira, particularly in the Azores, is that this was a place that was far removed from any of those places. And in Goa, you would have a lot of indigenous South Asian medicine. In Salvador de Bahia, you would have a lot of indigenous Amazonian medicine from the native peoples there. But in the Azores, you have medicine very far removed from its original contexts, being pressed into service to help the health of soldiers and sailors in the Portuguese world and the fleets that passed through. So one of the key, and many of you are familiar with this is one of the key works of Portuguese medicine from 1563. It's Garcia de Horta, is the second book published by Europeans in South Asia. But for more than 200 years, this was the key volume that described medicinal substances from India. And so some of the things that you find there are in use medicinally in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries in the Azores. This is a slightly later publication, Cristóvão da Costa, 1578. I use it because it has illustrations. Garcia de Horta did not have illustrations, but Cristóvão da Costa took a lot of information from Garcia de Horta when he published his work. So you have things like jackfruit and pepper and nutmeg, all of which had medicinal applications in Indian Ayurvedic medicine, which the Portuguese copied. They used them in much the same way, and they applied them in their medical facilities all over the world. In Ayurvedic medicine, you have tamarind used. This is from Manuel Godinho de Heredia in 1612. It's a manuscript that was only discovered in the 20th century and then was published by the Comissão de Descobrimentos, and so this is how we know about it. Ginger is the universal medicine in Ayurvedic medicine, and so we see this being used in various ways throughout the Portuguese world. It was evident in the records of the Hospital de Boa Hora in Terceira. This is a plant that has its origins in East Africa, Pereira brava, also known as Batua, and it was a root and a plant that could be used for injuries, scrapes, wounds, and other kinds of things, and we see this described in the Heredia book. Rhubarb, an important purgative in the context of humoral medicine, where balancing the health means balancing the bad humors in the body. Rhubarb was used as a way to help you to evacuate the bowels, good things to think about right after lunch. And so also to make your body balanced. So you have a number of these kinds of things. Opium, the only reliable pain treatment before the 20th century, really. And this is something that you find throughout the Portuguese world. In pharmacies, some of the people who are actually writing down and spreading this information are the Jesuits. Everywhere in the Portuguese world where you have a Jesuit pharmacy or an infirmary, they go hand in hand with the missionary institutions of the Jesuits. And so they often ran their own pharmacies. They profited and paid for some of their missionary activities with selling pharmaceutical medicines, and so they are a major conduit of information about medicine and drugs. I'm going to shift the focus geographically now to Brazil and see what kinds of things are being taken out of Brazil and also turn up in the records of the Azorean fortress on Terceira. One of them is this concoction, and it has many forms, but Tearagia brasilica, which was kind of a copy of a much older medicine that existed even in the medieval world, but it had 78 different plants that were in it, many of them taken from the Amazon. And it mixes things with other parts of the world as well. So it's part of that early hybridization that I was talking about. I'll say something about that again in just a minute. This is a Jesuit manuscript from Paraguay and Brazil, 1580. The very first page talks about, and the very first item is cacao, which was used for a variety of things. It was a super salubrious, we think about that too. Again, after lunch, it's nice to think about chocolate. But you know, it has the power to open the body's passages, comfort the mind, the stomach, aid the liver, aid asthmatics, and those with cataracts. All kinds of powers attributed to cocoa. Interesting stuff. This is, of course, what it looks like in its natural form, but a more practical and probably efficacious application was using the cocoa butter for skin ailments and for rashes and things like that. So you would find cocoa butter in the pharmacies of the Portuguese world. A really important medicine that comes from Brazil and Peru is cinchona, also known as Jesuit's bark or quinine, quina. And this, as a febrifuge, a fever reducer, was a game changer for colonization. It was an early way to treat tropical fevers in a real, genuinely efficacious way. I mean, a lot of these medicines have attributions that were probably more placebo than not, but this actually worked, and so did opium, of course. But this was a major important development, the adaptation of indigenous knowledge about Jesuit's bark that then led to it being used all over the Portuguese world. And we have pharmacy jars that show that as well. It's also one of the very first patent medicines, one of the first medicines that is compiled and sold as a medical concoction. And this is done by refugee conversos who were living in England and then brought the recipe back to Portugal, Águas de Inglaterra, where it was sold. It's a quinine including beverage. Jalapa, a purgative and a cathartic, also used for venereal disease. Ipecacuña, when I was a kid, every medicine cabinet at home would have a little bottle of syrup of ipecac, and if your child ate something that they shouldn't, you could induce vomiting by giving them this thing. It was a first aid measure, but it was used much earlier as a diaphoretic and emetic to make you vomit if you, well, again, in the context of humoral medicine. Yeah, copaiba, it's a balm. It could be used internally or externally. It was also used for gonorrhea. Sarsaparilla. And then the final, sort of the capstone, if you will, where this all comes together. As many of you know, the Jesuits were expelled from the Portuguese world in 1759, and they were invited to leave all over the empire and Portugal itself. When they retreated back to Rome, they decided that because so much of the medical knowledge that they had compiled over centuries was so valuable, that they wanted to write down in one place all of their most important medical recipes. And this is it. This is not printed. This is manuscript. And there's one copy of it. It's from 1766. It has hundreds and hundreds of recipes, medical recipes. But the thing that makes this really interesting to me is that the recipes are drawing medicinal knowledge from every continent and every place where the Jesuits had an institution. And so if you read, and many of you will have already read this, but the private secrets of the principal pharmacies of our company in Portugal, India, Macau, and Brazil, and there are others from Africa too included in these pages, the total hybridization of medicine, the total blending of medicine and medical culture from all over the Portuguese world is perfectly displayed in this one late, or rather mid 18th century document. And it's an extraordinary thing. To me, this is sort of the final proof of what's going on all over the Portuguese world. That comes together very nicely in the records of the hospital in Terceira, because you see evidence and echoes of all of this information being applied. Now, again, the documentation in Terceira is spotty. It doesn't cover every period, and not all drugs are being used all at the same time. But over time, you see the evidence of the empire being applied to sick and injured personnel of the Portuguese world here in the middle of the Atlantic. Things from the other side of the world, things from South America. It's an extraordinary document to see the kind of mixing that was happening here. And the physical evidence of this today, of course, is in the gardens in San Miguel, Terra Nostra, where many of those plants also have an expression and are on public display. So I find that kind of a curious end note to what I've been talking about. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much. But I do have that one image from 2 years ago where Sebastian is looking at where Christopher Columbus stopped in the Azores on his way back. So, all right. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Timothy, for keeping the time as promised. I'm now going to give the floor to Edgardo Silva, who is going to speak about Entangled in the Geopolitics of the Age, the Azores or Western Islands in the Anglo-American War of 1812. Edgardo Medeiros da Silva is an assistant professor of English at the School of Social and Political Science of the University of Lisbon, and a researcher within ULICES, the University of Lisbon Center for English Studies. His academic research is centered on American political history and culture, Luso-American relations, and the writings of Henry Adams. Some of his most recent scholarship includes the Azores or Western Islands on the European Grand Tour of William Eckling Prescott, 1815-1817, from 2024, Islander Sailors and Democratic Dignity, Azorian Seaman in Melville's Moby Dick or The Whale, 2022, and Recognition of Cuban Independence, Henry Adams and Empire Building from 2022. Once again, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to, of course, thank the organizing committee again for welcoming us here. It's my second time, and it's really a great pleasure to be here. Thank you. Well, I'd like to talk to you today about, thank you. And can I have the remote? Go. Thank you. I'd like to talk to you today about something that I came across when I was doing my PhD, something like 10 or 15 years ago. I was reading the pages of Adams' History of the United States, and I came across a chapter on something called the Battle of Fayal, and so that intrigued me. I kept it, in my notes, and so this is an opportunity to go back to that and to share some information. So it's still in kind of a very exploratory level, but I hope it makes sense what I have to tell you today. Whether wittingly or unwittingly, due to their strategic location in the North American and the North Atlantic basin, the Azores, Western Islands, as these isles are usually labeled in Anglo-American primary sources, as Timothy just told us, and this is a map that shows that right there before U.S. independence from 1755. So as I was saying, the Azores have been part of the various processes associated with trade, diasporas, piracy, and slavery, not to mention international politics and diplomacy. The first U.S. diplomatic representatives having been appointed to the archipelago in 1795 by none other than George Washington. John Street as consul to Horta, and Thomas Hickling Father as vice consul to Ponta Delgada. So drawing on Harry Adams' history of the United States in the administrations of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, especially his chapter 7 titled Sloops of War, this presentation briefly examines the underlying causes of the War of 1812, the use of privateering in it, and the diplomatic meanderings set in motion by the event, so as to bring to the fore the strategic importance of the archipelago in the geopolitics of the age. A New Englander and the third generation member of America's first political clan, with a lifelong passion for the origins of this country, Adams had a privileged access to Washington's corridors of power throughout his lifetime. Independently wealthy and prolific writer, he was a keen observer of post-Balão America, his vast correspondence, essays, but especially his autobiography, The Education of Harry Adams, published in 1918, offering insightful commentary and discussion on the United States and its leadership from Reconstruction all the way to the First World War. His 9-volume History of the United States that I just mentioned, a transitional work between the historical narratives of the literary romantic authors the first half of the 19th century and the scientific historians of the latter part of the century, is a telling narrative centered on how a young and energetic people succeeded in creating a body politic out of opposing political and economic forces. A strong pro-national stance regarding government and industry in the North, protection of states' rights, and a crop-based export economy based on slave labor in the South. Here you have the first edition of his history, of Adams' history, as you can see there on the left-hand side, and on the right, the latest edition from the Library of American Collection, and it's the standard work for researchers. The Anglo-American War of 1812, often termed America's Second War of Independence, was fought within the framework of a much larger conflict, the Napoleonic Wars, and the continental system or blockade set in place by the Berlin Decree of November 21st, 1806, prohibiting import of British goods into any European country allied with or dependent upon France, and strengthened 1 year later on December 17th, 1807, through the Milan Decree, authorizing the confiscation of any ship that had touched British ports before entering French waters. The British responded to Napoleon's continental blockade with the orders of in council of November the 17th, 1807, which required neutral ships, those of the United States included, to obtain authorizations from English ports before trading with France or any of its colonies. Though a neutral country in the conflict between these two European powers, the Napoleonic Wars placed the United States in a difficult position, as both France and Britain endeavored to block the United States from trading freely with the other in a sort of economic warfare. In this context, for instance, British courts had declared it to be an illegal practice and subject to confiscation the activity of American merchant vessels buying goods in the French Antilles, then heading to American ports for a stopover to dissimulate the origin of the goods, and next proceeding to French ports where the merchandise could be unloaded and sold. In an attempt to put a stop to this practice, a very lucrative business for American merchants, the British Navy began to harass American vessels, confiscating their cargoes and seriously disrupting U.S. commerce with friendly nations. It was a no-win situation for American ships. If they obeyed Britain, they faced capture by the French in European ports, and if they complied with the French, they violated Britain's orders in council. Although there are other reasons, which I won't get into for a question of time, trade stands out as the most important factor that led to the War of 1812. Suffice it to say that together with other destabilizing tactics on the part of Britain, such as supporting Indian tribes, impressing sailors from American ships, and encouraging divisions between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, tensions led to open conflict between the United States and its former colonial power in June 1812, when President James Madison, unable to overcome the impasse in relations, sent a message to Congress with a justification for war, and which was approved by a tight margin, 79 in favor, 49 against in the House, and 19 in favor, 13 in the Senate. Portugal and the Azores became entangled in the War of 1812 by virtue of the country's historical alliance with Great Britain. With the seat of government in Rio de Janeiro following the French invasions of the mainland, Portugal officially declared its neutrality at the start of the conflict, but its ties to England and its strategic location along the Atlantic seaboard made this neutrality untenable. José Rademacher, a Portugal chargé d'affaires in Washington at the time, informed James Monroe, President Madison's Secretary of State, on October the 8th, 1812, of the country's neutrality status in the conflict that had just begun. Successive violations of Portugal's neutrality status on the part of Britain, its long-standing ally, as I just said, though placed the country in an uncomfortable position. What to do about the incidents whereby the Royal Navy apprehended and or attacked U.S. merchant ships or privateers in sea waters under Portuguese jurisdiction, such as the General Armstrong. The fact is that these various diplomatic moves that I just mentioned, including, of course, Napoleon's continental system, Britain's orders in council, Jefferson's trade embargo, Act of 1807, etc., these impacted the trade carried out between the Azores and both Great Britain and the United States. On account of these, the Azores became a sort of entrepot for American products reshipped illegally to English ports. We know, for instance, that the business activities of the U.S. consul at Fayal, John Bass Dabney, as an importer and exporter of goods and supplier of vessels crossing the Atlantic, which he accumulated with his diplomatic post, benefited usually from these maneuvers. Here it is, a portrait of John Bass. He writes, John Bass, that is, Dabney, he writes in one of his letters dated February the 20th, 1811, before the start of the War of 1812, that the previous year, 1809-1810, 160 American merchant vessels, 3/4 of which consigned to him arrived in Fayal harbor. Well, moving on now to the actual account of the Battle of Fayal in Adams' history. His account of the Battle of Fayal possesses all the ingredients of a good story for those interested in the history of the early history of the United States as an independent nation. The narratives of the literary romantic historians of antebellum America were supposed to entertain, besides imparting historical information. And Adams' description of the confrontation off the waters of the Bay of Horta certainly contained the necessary elements to attract a reading audience: characters, setting, plot, and action. The episode is marked by Adams' colorful use of language, which add emotion and excitement to the narrative, not to mention his characteristic subjectivity shown in his occasional personal considerations. Nonetheless, and in line with the precepts of the so-called scientific historians, he makes extensive use of documentary evidence in his text, quoting from the report Captain Robert Lloyd of HMS Plantagenet had sent Rear Admiral Brown on September 28, 1814, describing the engagement, the naval engagement, and the affidavits provided by the officers directly involved in the operations, enclosed by Lloyd in his report, and from the letter Captain Samuel Chester Reed of the General Armstrong, I'll give you a bit more details about that in a minute, had sent to American authorities on October the 4th, 1814, including also dispatches forwarded by John Bass Dabney, the consul, to the State Department, dated October the 5th, 1814, and October the 15th, 1814. It is clear also from his footnotes that Adams consulted official documents at the British Archives and the State Department, including Niles' Register, an important source of information for historians in those days, again, all in accordance with the teachings of the professional historians of late 19th century America. Here's the first edition of Niles' Register. Undoubtedly, the purpose of Adams' detailed account of the battle off the waters of Horta Harbor was not only to tell a good story surrounding a major naval confrontation between a single American privateer and the 3 ships of war from the all-powerful Royal Navy, but also to set the record straight, implying that the report submitted to Rear Admiral Brown by the commander of the Plantagenet was not entirely accurate. His report, and I quote, told the story as he wished to be told, he observes. In addition, Adams wishes to question the conduct of the British commander and his officers in the face of the harassment inflicted upon them by American privateers in Fayal and elsewhere. As he puts it, and I quote, "Under the annoyance of their mortifications, the British commanders broke through ordinary rules," end of quote. The ordinary rules Adams had in mind are the fact that the confrontation had taken place in a neutral port, allegedly violated by the Americans when they fired at the British reconnaissance boats. Succinctly, the American privateer, General Armstrong, equipped with 7 guns and the 42-pounder Long Tom cannon, was already at the harbor of Fayal when the Royal Naval Squadron arrived there on September the 26th, 1814 at nightfall, en route to Jamaica and Louisiana a few months before the peace treaty between Britain and the United States was signed in the Belgian city of Ghent on December the 24th, 1814. Commanded by Captain Samuel Chester Reed. Here I have first. This is Horta, a drawing from the mid-19th century, as you can see there, with the fort which stands out right in front of it. So, as I was saying, commanded by Captain Chester Reed, the General Armstrong was, and I quote, "a brig which for 2 years had fretted and escaped the British Navy," end of quote. The British Navy squadron, on the other hand, was composed of HMS Plantagenet, 74-gunner, commanded by Captain Robert Lloyd, accompanied by 2 ships of war, the HMS Carnation, commanded by Captain George Bentham, and the HMS Rhoda, 38 guns, commanded by Captain Philip Somerville. I have here also a portrait of Captain Samuel Reed, and here a drawing of the privateer, the brig General Armstrong. According to Adams, the first confrontation unfolded as follows. On the evening of September 26, 1814, at approximately 8 p.m., 4 boats filled with men approached the General Armstrong. And I quote, "As they came near, the captain, Captain Reed, repeatedly hailed and warned them off, and at last fired. His fire was returned, and the boats withdrew with the loss of a number of men." Captain Lloyd's report, end of quotation. Captain Lloyd's report, however, told a different story, namely that the boats had been sent simply, and I quote, "to watch her movements." On his approaching the schooner, he, Lieutenant Robert Fawcett, who had been instructed by Captain Bentham of the Carnation to approach the privateer, so he was ordered to keep off, or they would fire into him, upon which the boat was immediately backed off, but to his astonishment, he received a broadside of round, grape, and musketry, which did considerable damage. This is, of course, from the report sent by Captain Lloyd. The fact is that the men on the boats sent to watch her movements, to observe her proceedings of the General Armstrong, were indeed armed, killing 1 American crew member and injuring the first lieutenant. Yes, when fire was returned. It is an inconsistency Adams does not fail to point out, adding that the 4 boats, and I quote, "approached as enemies in the night with a large armed force immediately behind them." In the face of the danger posed to the vessel, Captain Reed readied the General Armstrong to defend it, bringing his vessel, and I quote, "close to the beach under the fort that I just showed you, knowing that a British assault would surely come." In Captain Lloyd's view, the boldness of the attack on the part of the General Armstrong, when it fired upon boats simply, which had been simply sent to inquire, had violated the neutrality of the port and totally justified the destruction of the American privateer. So, incensed by the beating, at around midnight, he ordered the attack, led by Lieutenants William Matterface of the Rhoda and Bowerbank of the Plantagenet. Official records state that 7 boats and approximately 180 men were involved in the offensive, but the figures differ. Adams writes in his account of the second confrontation that on the British side, 12 boats took part in the offensive with a crew of 200 men, whilst on the American side, the numbers were much more modest, with approximately 90 sailors having participated in the engagement. Adams vividly recounts the episode as follows, as you can see that, using his usual, vivid language, typical of these romantic historians. The losses were heavy on the British side, 2/3 of the assailants either killed or wounded. He writes that Lieutenants Bowerbank, Coswell, and Rogers of the Rota were killed, plus 38 seamen and 83 wounded. The first and fourth and fifth lieutenants of the Plantagenet were also wounded, and 22 seamen killed and 24 wounded. On the American side, 9 killed or wounded. Adams, of course, inflates the numbers slightly. Official records state that 34, crew members were killed and 86 wounded on the British side, and 2 killed and 7 wounded on the American side. In total, 2 British boats were sunk, 2 were captured, and the remaining ones were loaded with the dead and disabled and brought back to the squadron. I have here some drawings. This is an illustration from Currier and Ives, from a famous American lithographer. Here, the scene of the battle. Here's another one, also another painting describing the confrontation, as you can see there. And here's still another one, a much later one, which is also showing the importance of this confrontation. Two major factors account for the failed attack on the General Armstrong, according to Captain Lloyd's report. And I quote, "From her side being on the rocks, and every American in Fayal, exclusive of the part of the crew, being armed and concealed in these rocks, which were immediately over the privateer." End of quotation. These facts, compounded with a very destructive fire from above, from those above them, from the shore, who were in complete security, led to the disaster, in which many lives were lost and many sailors wounded, according to Captain Lloyd's report. We can only imagine with what concern these events were watched by the people of Horta. Adams notes that the local population, the governor included, witnessed from the shore the events unfolding in front of their eyes. And I quote, "The adjacent rocks lined with armed Americans," according to Lloyd's report. One of the witnesses was John Bass, Dabney's eldest son, Charles William Dabney, then a 20-year-old, who saw everything from the fort, including the shots fired by the vessels in the direction of the fort. Despite having incurred few losses and repulsed the 2 boat attacks, it was clear the General Armstrong was no match for the Royal Navy squadron, and that it could not escape Azorian waters unscathed. The decision, therefore, could only be one: if the privateer was not to follow to the ground, President Madison having to flee and take refuge in the mountains along the Potomac. The battlefield aroused American patriotism and a triumph and motive in the conflict. News of the event was widely reported in the American press, with Captain portrayed as an hero for the prowess displayed in facing a Royal Navy squadron. And I have here, just to finish off, here, an article from the American press published in the Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken. No, it's just I don't have the source of this. It was not possible to identify it. Basically, just showing, Captain Chester Reed as a hero of the battle. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Edgardo. Now I'm going to give the floor to our colleague from France, Estelle Amilien. I'm sorry for my rusty French. I'll try to read your bio note as correctly as possible. Estelle is going to speak about Essor de l'aviation péruvienne, importance des relations avec la France. Estelle Amilien belongs to the center with the sigla ILCA4 CERHIS from Université Grenoble Alpes et maîtrise de conférences en civilisation latino-américaine contemporaine depuis 2022. Elle a commencé à travailler sur les thématiques liées à l'aviation au cours de sa thèse de doctorat pour voir comment cette technique nouvelle avait été exploitée en vue de mieux intégrer et surtout contrôler les espaces amazoniens de Pérou. Une publication liée à ce travail a eu lieu dans la revue Amazonia Pérou 2019. Amazonia y Aviación hace un cambio de las representaciones. Elle se concentre actuellement sur les mutations de l'aviation en Amazonie péruvienne depuis sa création, les lignes établies en 1928 à nos jours. Estelle, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Tout d'abord, merci beaucoup pour tous les organisateurs. On est vraiment choyés. Donc, merci et toutes mes excuses pour certaines choses. J'ai répondu très, très tard. Et merci aussi à tous les collègues de manière plus générale pour les échanges, des fois informels, les temps qui sont pas mesurables, qui ne se comptent pas en argent, mais en fait, sans qui j'aurais jamais connu votre événement. Donc, merci pour l'organisation. Puis, il y a tous les gens qui font connaître ou qui nous poussent à connaître. Et donc, pour m'inscrire dans la continuité sur l'articulation entre mobilité et connaissance, cette fois, on prend l'avion. Et le slogan en Pérou, c'est Arriba, siempre arriba, qui est associé à des prouesses dont des premiers aviateurs, puis en général associé lorsqu'il y a malheureusement des décès. Ça sera souvent la première chose, soit qu'on crie, soit qu'on mobilise. Et donc, pour travailler sur l'aviation et la relation entre l'essor de l'aviation péruvienne et la France, je vais commencer dans les années 1910, plutôt en Europe et en France, jusqu'à nos jours, avec des périodisations qui peuvent varier, en fait, suivant les thématiques ou les approches qui vont être traitées. Pour l'essor, j'ai pris une définition assez classique du trésor de la langue française informatisée, et j'en ai pris deux, puisqu'elle la notion à la fois de se donner libre cours, de s'approprier des choses pour en donner une mesure, puis s'acheminer vers un épanouissement. Et une autre nuance qui est celle de développement rapide et de progression soutenue, puisqu'on va voir les deux, en fait, dans le cas du Pérou, à différents moments. Et donc, l'aviation, de nombreuses définitions. Au départ, c'est plutôt traité de façon sportive, en tout cas au Pérou, et c'est surtout une activité qui regroupe de nombreux acteurs, que ce soit individuels, collectifs, militaires, civils, puis commerciaux en termes d'intérêt. Et comme c'est un travail de recherche en cours, il y a un certain nombre de sources différentes. Parfois, je vous dirais, j'attends encore des informations ou alors on m'a pas donné accès. C'est les principes de la recherche. Voilà, juste pour que vous le sachiez. Et donc, la première période, celle qui commence dans les années 1910, c'est bon, ça se projette totalement pour vous. C'est celle plutôt des prouesses et de la forge des héros et de ce slogan « Arriba, siempre arriba », qui est associé en fait à l'objectif qui vont se fixer des aviateurs péruviens de traverser les Alpes en avion. Le premier, le plus connu, est Jorge Chávez, celui qui donne le nom à l'aéroport international de Lima. Malheureusement, il fait un vol, il est blessé et il décède. Donc, Biélorussie, quelques années plus tard, en hommage, et toujours avec cette opiniâtreté aussi, lui réussit en 1913. Et ce sont des événements qui sont extrêmement suivis au Pérou. Mais tout ça se passe en Europe. Pourquoi? Parce que c'est en Europe, en particulier en France, que sont formés et délivrés les brevets d'aviation. Donc, la plupart du temps, on a le parcours de personnes qui sont soit d'origine péruvienne, soit péruviens, et qui viennent en Europe pour se former. Et donc là, on est bien dans l'idée de mobilité et de transfert de connaissances, puisqu'à ce moment-là, l'aviation se commente, l'aviation est admirée en Amérique latine, mais elle n'est pas encore vraiment pratiquée. Et donc, tous ces figures-là deviennent vraiment des stars, on va dire, de l'époque, et tout est suivi. Et la moindre chose qui leur arrive est terrible. Donc, Biélorussie a survécu à son accident de voiture, mais ça a défrayé la chronique sur des pages et des pages en 1928. Et donc là, c'est une des publications qui permet de voir les deux aviateurs. Du point de vue de l'aviation, le premier temps va surtout être militaire, aussi bien du côté pour la France que pour les Péruviens en termes de collaboration. Et c'est principalement la mission aéronautique française en termes de relations diplomatiques et qui intervient dès la fin du 19e siècle, et ce jusque dans les années 1940, puisque va avoir lieu une guerre entre le Pérou et l'Équateur qui va marquer un tournant. Et après cette guerre-là, le choix va sortir plutôt vers les États-Unis. Donc, c'est le petit panneau attention, c'est qu'en effet, j'ai eu beaucoup de sources militaires qui pointent la question de l'accessibilité aux sources et aussi de la méthodologie ou de la précaution, en fait, d'usage des sources militaires, puisque c'est souvent à la gloire d'eux, c'est souvent lié à l'institution, à du prestige. Ça veut pas dire qu'il n'y a pas de prestige, mais voilà, ça fait partie des biais possibles. Et De la Jara, avec Pradaefio, ce sont les deux auteurs d'histoire militaire, les deux sont d'histoire de l'aviation et les deux sont militaires. En quoi consiste le rôle de la mission aéronautique française à la formation? Surveiller les exercices qui sont réalisés, déterminer, par exemple, certains seuils, certaines altitudes. Et dès le départ, en fait, ce sont des militaires, il y a la visée militaire de formation, mais il n'est pas exclu, dès 1912, une visée commerciale. Donc, c'est vraiment l'idée du point de départ. Et si dans le titre, j'ai mis rôle important de la France, c'est parce que nous ne sommes pas seuls. Et souvent, les alliances diplomatiques ou les choix se font selon les chefs d'État. En l'occurrence, dans les années 1920, il y a un autocrate au Pérou qui s'appelle Augusto Leguía, qui va faire le choix, lui, par exemple, de se porter un peu plus vers l'Allemagne. Donc, il y a des fois des va-et-vient, mais suite à un conflit avec la Colombie, retour en 1932 jusqu'à la guerre en Équateur avec le partenariat français. Et je vous invite, si ça vous intéresse, François Bignon a soutenu sa thèse en 2020 et travaille particulièrement sur ce point-là. Et a plusieurs chapitres de sa thèse totalement dédiés à ces éléments-là, au rôle de la mission française, en soulignant justement les transferts culturels, le transfert d'un savoir de pointe et aussi l'exploitation, un peu à double sens du point de vue du gouvernement, le côté pratique, mais aussi l'image de marque. On se modernise, on se tient au courant auprès d'une grande puissance. Conséquence, pour l'aviation péruvienne, c'est bien d'être formé, mais désormais, on veut aussi vertébrer, constituer une institution propre pour pouvoir, à terme, fonctionner de manière la plus autonome possible. Et donc là, je vous ai mis une chronologie indicative qui donne les principales étapes en me focalisant surtout sur le début. Et comme ce sont des militaires, c'est souvent en effet les moments de guerre ou de conflit, de tension qui vont cristalliser en fait les moments de formation, les achats de matériel. Ça peut être aussi à l'inverse. Par exemple, De la Jara est très critique sur le conflit colombien et donc tire la sonnette d'alarme en disant « Ok, d'accord, il n'y a pas eu de mort en fait liée au combat. Ils sont tous morts, soit de déshydratation, de maladie, mais rien par rapport au combat. Mais il y a des choses qui sont pas très glorieuses. Pareil, François Bignon, pour le conflit avec l'Équateur, souligne quelques limites. Et donc, ça pousse, voilà, c'est plutôt épisodique par la suite. Et l'une des conséquences aussi du conflit entre le Pérou et l'Équateur, c'est que en 1941, l'aviation, tout ce qui est aéronautique, va enfin obtenir son propre ministère. Jusque-là, ils étaient rattachés à la marine, puisque c'était dans les corps de l'armée. Ils ont été associés à la marine, en partie aussi parce que ce sont des marins de formation qui ont été formés en premier à l'aviation, ou par les espaces où ils sont intervenus, qui étaient des espaces où intervenait traditionnellement la marine. À partir des années 1940, on a un ministère propre dédié à cela, et juste le changement de nom de Cuerpo Aeronáutico del Perú à Fuerza Aérea del Perú plus récemment. Alors, la guerre, c'est une chose, la paix en est une autre. Dans le contexte de la guerre froide, où ils ne sont pas forcément impliqués ou pas les principales puissances, ça va quand même être pour le Pérou un enjeu principal de savoir comment se définir ou comment se positionner au cas où, et surtout de choisir des alliés. Donc c'est dans cette période-là où l'essor des relations avec les États-Unis est croissante d'un point de vue aviation, et où donc on perd un peu si on prend le côté français. Et il y a une préoccupation d'un point de vue interne, cette fois, puisqu'on maîtrise une technique qui est l'aviation, de plus en plus d'affirmer ses frontières. Alors, à nouveau, c'est cyclique, c'est parce que, alors à nouveau, là, il y a un autre dictateur en place, mais c'est aussi parce qu'il y a la logique étatique de revendiquer ceci est au Pérou, ceci est au Brésil. Et je vous ai mis l'un des cas sur lequel je travaille, qui est donc Puerto Esperanza, c'est la toute petite partie que j'ai entourée sur la carte, qui est très isolée et où on choisit délibérément d'ouvrir une piste d'attaque. Il n'y avait pas du tout. D'envoyer quelqu'un avec un groupe de gens, des machettes. Vous devez ouvrir une piste et on va faire des rotations, mais qui reste très aléatoire puisque si c'est pas entretenu, forcément, ça peut se dégrader. Et le choix, par exemple, d'asphalter la piste dans les années 90, c'était pour réorienter en principe vers une visée touristique. Alors, j'y étais au mois de juillet, vous voyez l'état de la piste. Alors, pourquoi aussi je parle de l'Amazonie, c'est parce que la première ligne régulière, comme l'a rappelé Sandra dans la présentation, c'est la première ligne en fait qui est instaurée. L'idée étant de pouvoir intervenir vite en Amazonie si besoin, avec beaucoup de préjugés, c'est des rebelles, ils en veulent à l'État péruvien, mais aussi d'articuler le pays parce qu'il y a des endroits qui ne sont accessibles que par l'aviation. Et donc, ces trajets-là vont être prioritairement, voire exclusivement, réalisés par les militaires. Et donc, la grille de tarifs que je vous mets, c'est tiré de la revue Aviation, qui est une revue militaire. Et donc, on vous publiait les tarifs par kilomètre parcouru. Alors, arrive la vraie paix, sans guerre froide, et une recomposition des rôles. Puisque il existe toujours des militaires, une armée de l'air. Mais que fait donc l'armée de l'air? Bien sûr, elle s'entraîne, au cas où. Mais il y a une redistribution en fait, du rôle des missions en lien avec l'aviation, propre au Pérou, qui est ce qu'on appelle los vuelos de acción cívica. Globalement, ce sont les vols exceptionnels, souvent dans des endroits difficiles d'accès. Ça peut être lié à des catastrophes naturelles. Donc, parfois, ça peut être des villes sur la côte, mais il y a un tremblement de terre. Hop, on envoie un avion de l'armée ou un hélicoptère. Et il y a surtout la question d'adaptation. Pourquoi? Parce que si la piste est en terre ou la piste est trop détériorée, on ne peut pas y aller avec un avion à roues. Donc, il faut un hélico, par exemple. Ou dans certains endroits, il faut des hydravions ou des amphibies. Alors ça, c'est la théorie. Dans la réalité, le problème, il y a des problèmes de budget. Il y a parfois aussi des problèmes aléatoires parce qu'on établit un programme et, sauf urgence, on suit ce programme-là. Parfois, il y a des problèmes de météo, de plein de choses. Le vol se fait pas. Et donc, même s'il y a des vols qui sont établis en principe tous les mois, tous les 2 mois, tous les 3 mois, ça peut être suspendu. Donc, par exemple, Puerto Esperanza, fut un temps, ils avaient un vol d'action civique tous les 15 jours avec ravitaillement. Désormais, c'est tous les 3 mois. Cette année, ils viennent en septembre. Ne me demandez pas la date. À Puerto Esperanza, ils n'ont pas non plus. En tout cas, pas encore. Donc, il y a aussi ce côté fluctuant. En théorie, peuvent être véhiculés à la fois de la marchandise et des personnes, puisque c'est des zones qui sont difficiles d'accès. Dans la réalité, par exemple, à Porto Esperança, le vol d'action civique n'est jamais conducteur de personnes. Ce qui fait que ça rajoute une pression sur l'aviation non militaire pour pouvoir que ces personnes arrivent par avion. Et l'autre cas de figure, ou l'autre mission principale, ce sont les ambulances aériennes ou évacuations sanitaires qui sont appelées MEDEVAC. Et à nouveau, là, on peut retrouver une filiation aussi avec la France, puisque tout ce qui sont les bases, en fait, de l'évacuation sanitaire, c'est le docteur Chassin, la Convention de 1929. J'imagine peut-être que parmi vous, certains connaissent mieux. Donc, la caractérisation initiale, c'est celle formulée en 1929. Au Pérou, le critère de stabilisation est requis avant évacuation, ce qui peut être compliqué puisque dans certains endroits, il n'y a littéralement qu'un poste de santé avec un infirmier, on va dire, à mi-chemin entre infirmier et médecin généraliste, qui doit juger s'il faut évacuer ou pas. En sachant que s'il se trompe, en théorie, l'État peut lui demander de rembourser. Alors, pourquoi ça peut être compliqué? Parce que, alors le but, j'ai juste fait un schéma pour que ça soit peut-être plus rapide, c'est parce que le patient, lui, bien sûr, ne va pas financer. Et alors, vu le coût de la santé au Pérou, il vaut mieux qu'il n'ait pas à financer. Mais une évacuation sanitaire coûte $2 200 par heure de vol, plus un tarif plancher de $2 pour l'équipement qui est à bord. Donc, la facture est quand même adressée à quelqu'un où sera réglé. Donc, ce n'est pas le patient qui règle, mais si le médecin, on trouve que le médecin, il est un peu trop l'ordonnance facile d'évacuation, on pourra lui reprocher ou lui demander de financer. Le critère, c'est l'urgence, l'impossibilité de traiter, que le patient soit stabilisé, et ensuite, le patient est redirigé au plus proche, mais souvent jusqu'à Lima. Dernier aspect, où on va retrouver un partenariat plus marqué avec la France, c'est la diversification des acteurs, puisque, alors je vous ai principalement parlé de militaires, mais il n'y a pas que des militaires, notamment Elmer Fawcett, qui est le premier, peut-être le plus connu au Pérou. Il a réussi un raid, donc c'est la première photo, au début des années 1920, pour aller jusqu'à Iquitos. C'est lui qui a créé la première compagnie aérienne commerciale, qui s'appelle Fawcett, et qui a duré pendant plus de 60 ans, donc qui est plutôt un record dans le panorama péruvien. Et l'une de ses particularités, c'est qu'au-delà de la première compagnie péruvienne, c'est qu'il disposait de ses propres hangars. Donc c'est eux qui étaient capables de monter certaines parties des avions, de les réparer, donc il n'y avait pas d'externalisation du service et une moindre dépendance par rapport à d'autres puissances. La première ligne qu'ils ont établie, c'est une ligne sur la côte. C'est plus pratique, ça permet de faire rentrer de l'argent et après de se diversifier. Et comme lui a réussi à aller en Amazonie, ils se sont ensuite diversifiés vers l'Amazonie. Pour faire face au tourisme, on a un essor et une multiplication des compagnies aériennes. Globalement, sur le XXe siècle, jusqu'aux années 80-90, plutôt une stabilité dans les compagnies. Alors, quelques-unes périclitent, certaines sont rachetées, fusionnent. Mais c'est le contexte du terrorisme, de la crise économique, de l'inflation des années 80 qui va bouleverser ça. La fin de certaines nationalisations aussi. Et on assiste désormais à plutôt une fragilité de certaines compagnies. Viva Air, par exemple, qui était une compagnie low cost, n'a duré que quelques années. Air Majoro, qui se spécialise dans les vols subsidiados, donc c'est des vols où l'État paye une partie pour ne pas désavantager les citoyens puisqu'ils dépendent de l'aviation pour pouvoir voyager, et les évacuations sanitaires. Mais ils ne font que ça. Donc c'est pareil, suivant les destinations, ça peut être compliqué ou les mettre en danger. Et donc, alors il y a une erreur de numérotation, mais le tourisme, dans le cas de l'Amazonie, est évoqué dès le départ. On est passé directement de la prouesse à la projection, dès 1928. Armachassin, qui est un spécialiste du tourisme au Pérou, a souligné que l'aviation a marqué un tournant en fait dans les années 1950. Le paquebot de croisière se réinvente, mais c'est vraiment l'aviation pour le Pérou qui va prendre le pas et standardiser. L'Amazonie reste de nos jours un lieu privilégié de tourisme et à développer. Là, ce sont les Mincetur, c'est le ministère du Commerce extérieur et du Tourisme. Et les principales lignes, donc je vous ai mis les lignes, enfin un code couleur, même si le principal lieu touristique, vous vous en doutez, c'est Machu Picchu, avec ses déboires, ses excès, les critiques qui peuvent exister. Là, le dessin de 112, c'est pour montrer que les critiques sont pas nouvelles. Les protestations, c'était dans le cadre du centenaire d'Hiram Bingham, et le dessin est plus récent, et donc on voit bien l'intérêt, puisque le tourisme peut représenter jusqu'à 10% du PIB. Donc il y a un intérêt, mais qui en bénéficie vraiment, ça pose souci. Et non sans ironie, j'étais encore au Pérou que le reportage sur TF1, récent, qui réactualise cela. D'un point de vue des compagnies, la première à opérer, c'est la Panagra, puis Air France à partir des années 1950. Là, ce sont des extraits d'El Comercio, qui se vantait ensuite, fin des années 60, à votre service en el mundo entero, avec une promotion d'un package de 35 jours pour découvrir l'Europe. Donc, on voit bien la France comme porte d'entrée qui diffuse ensuite vers d'autres pays. Il va sans dire que c'est pour des gens de la très haute société, ou en tout cas des gens qui sont des couches supérieures de la population. Le billet reste cher aujourd'hui. À l'époque, c'était encore plus élitiste. Et secteur devenu clé depuis cette période-là, avec à nouveau les fluctuations clairement des années du terrorisme, de la crise économique, donc ça c'est années 80, tout début du premier mandat de Fujimori, puis retour, notamment d'Air France, qui a été absente pendant 16 ans du pays. Pourquoi ? Parce qu'en fait, depuis, il y avait eu d'autres compagnies. Donc là où au départ, il y avait plutôt un monopole et Air France faisait l'attrait et rediffusait en Europe, il y a eu d'autres compagnies comme Air Europa, Iberia, qui ont gagné de l'importance et qui ont posé des soucis d'un point de vue concurrence. Et donc en 2016, Air France revient désormais avec des contrats signés avec Prompero. Et l'autre cas limite, forcément, c'est la pandémie qui a marqué un temps d'arrêt. Et donc là, les dernières projections, c'est des années les plus récentes pour montrer justement la récupération progressive du tourisme, en essayant de mettre en perspective la France. Alors, autres éléments, c'est peut-être maladroit comme dénomination, mais pour montrer, par exemple, la position de l'Espagne, qui est très constante et beaucoup plus haut dans le classement, et à l'inverse, Amsterdam, qui était plutôt bien positionné et qui semble être en recul sur les dernières années. Et donc, en conclusion, la France n'est pas le seul partenariat. L'Europe et la France ont eu un rôle très important dès le départ, dès la genèse, dans la formation des premiers pilotes, les références, le transfert de compétences et dans l'essor du tourisme dans les années 1950, même si on observe par la suite un recul. Et donc les autres acteurs, notamment les États-Unis d'Amérique, d'un point de vue matériel ou de formation, l'Allemagne, la Russie, l'Italie, et en dernière information ou anecdote, est en train de se négocier un contrat pour acheter 24 avions de chasse. La décision n'a pas encore été rendue, mais on est dans le trio final. Donc, à voir si le choix se porte sur la France, la Suède ou les États-Unis. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Estelle. Thank you very much. I appreciate very much your concern with time. All the speakers were very well behaved in matters of time. So now it's my pleasure to open the floor for questions or comments. Tume, please.
Thank you. So I have one for Timothy and one for Edgardo. For Timothy, I'm very interested in the idea that the Azores were a platform or a hub for knowledge transfers. Can we see learning happening as to medicine? So can we see, I don't know, someone who, so maybe circumstantial evidence, someone who's been in the Azores and then has got knowledge about plants from India or whatever. Yeah. Or is there evidence, written evidence, or based on your knowledge of the sources, is there a place where maybe we can find this kind of evidence?
Yeah. No, there's no formal training of medicine happening at the level of like a school or even an official sort of apprenticeship. The way medical knowledge happens during much of the early modern period is that you have a kind of an apprenticeship that's done informally with younger physicians working with older physicians. But I think it's fair to say that because of the practices that were being put into place at the level of the infirmary, that people were learning by sort of copying what they saw being done. And the learning that was being brought in was a kind of a practical learning that had been learned in other parts of the world and then applied in the hospital in Terceira. But so if you want to look for something that's more formalized, I don't think so. But if you want to look at something that's more informal and a knowledge dissemination, then that's there, in my opinion. Now, in the later era, in the 19th century, about the time that the hospital was going through extraordinary changes, the entire medical profession is going through extraordinary changes. And so you have a more formalization of medical training in Lisbon and in some of the various remaining centers of the Portuguese world. So there's a hospital founded in Goa, for example, in the 1840s that is a much more sort of modernized place where there's a formal program of medical training. And of course, in Brazil is no longer a Portuguese colonial area, but they start to change the way they teach medicine in places like Ouro Preto and centers of the Portuguese world there. So I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so for Edgardo, thank you. For Edgardo, it's Theodore Roosevelt in his History of the Naval War of 1812. He says that this was a very important encounter because it delayed British reinforcements to the campaign where they were trying to take New Orleans, the British. And then this was useful for that. Do you have an opinion on, does this make sense, or is
that's exactly what I've read as well. You know, the squadron was en route to provide help to the British Army in Louisiana. In the meantime, Andrew Jackson, had his major victory, the New Orleans battle, which was after, in fact, the peace was signed, which is interesting because the peace was signed in December 1814. And the confrontations, the conflicts continued until February or March of the following year because they had not heard the news that the peace had been signed. So that's exactly what I've read as well. What is interesting is that, of course, the British has much more success, on land in their confrontations with the United States than in the sea, and that's why Adams, stresses this as an important, battle because the United States had these major victories in the sea. And another interesting aspect, of course, is at that time, the U.S. had a very, small, limited navy. And so the privateers were used as their ships, vessels of war, in fact. And we know that this was a very profitable activity for the shipbuilders of Boston, New York, Baltimore, etc., because they could get, huge profits from the booty, the cargo, and etc. So this was a very profitable activity. It's interesting that we have also, something related to this. From 1816 to 1820, our diplomatic representative in Washington was the Abad de Serra. And he writes these fantastic letters, complaining to the U.S. government about, the American, merchants, preying on Portuguese cargo. And of course, Spanish cargo, especially because many of them were working for the Banda Larga, of José Artigas, the independence of Latin American colonies, etc., or Spanish colonies. So they were, basically apprehending these ships, whether they were Portuguese, or Spanish, and so there's lots of interesting information about that, and Portugal, Portuguese government trying to get compensation for these ships that were, apprehended, by American privateers, and unsuccessfully, in fact, and always it's always the issue is always neutrality. And I mean, this case was continued until the late 19th century. The owners of the General Armstrong trying to get compensation from the Portuguese government, etc., etc., etc. In the end, they lost because the Americans were the first to violate the neutrality of the port by firing on the 4 boats that were sent. And this was the argument, the loss of the violation of the neutrality of the port of Horta. That's essentially the issue.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Just a really quick follow-up. So a very common tactic at the time was something called a cutting out expedition, where ships would send boats with armed men into a port to swarm aboard a vessel and take it over and then tow it out of the harbor. And the British did this all the time. It's really well documented. So I'm wondering if there isn't any evidence at all in the ship's log of the British fleet that says we send these guys on a cutting out expedition, the 4 boats that went in, because that's certainly what they were doing. They intended to, I think, I think that's what any commander would have done in that situation.
Really? Yeah.
So
the report that I read, that was put together by the captain of the Plantagenet, says that were just sent there to inquire, to see to inquire, to see what was going on, etc., etc. But of course, I don't know. I mean, the fact that if the Americans had not fired, they would have been attacked in the following day or whatever, which is what happened, in fact, at midnight. Actually, it was not midnight. It was first around 8 p.m. and then midnight, the major attack, and then the scuttling took place in the following day.
Thank you both. Now I give the floor for another question. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to ask to Timothy, have you found any sources about different disease? For example, for me, it's very interesting the sexually transmitted disease was in Spain was very interesting because it's very contagious. And another disease important is leprosy, because the leprosy was the most important in mortality in the 16th and 17th centuries, and in the 18th centuries the smallpox too. Then for me it's very important because this disease produce fear in authority and in people. Another form of culture and mentalities. Thank you.
So with specific regard to leprosy, there was a major project done about the history of the treatment of leprosy by the Wellcome Trust in Britain about 15 years ago. And I was one of the researchers on that project to look in Portuguese archives for this kind of work. And I provided them with some of that. In almost all of the formal written medical guides, the pharmacopoeias, the guides for surgeons, and any kind of written document, some of them are manuscript, but some of them are actually printed. The first Portuguese pharmacopoeia is in 1704, and then it's revised several times in the 18th century. In all of those documents, you have explicit medical recipes for sexually transmitted diseases. Typically gonorrhea and syphilis. And so they were always looking for ways to do this, to treat it. One of the sarsaparilla that I put up on the board was an early one. And one of the reasons for early colonization in North America by the British was to try to find a source for plants that were thought to be efficacious for sexually transmitted diseases. So they were common in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and medicine was always, and because there was money in it. I mean, medicines were low bulk, high profit goods. And so they always were part of the cargoes that rounded out, that topped up the additional goods that were being brought from Brazil, from South Asia, from China. Medicine's always composed a part of that. and medicine specifically for sexually transmitted diseases were part of that too.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for a final question, please.
My final question is to Estelle. If you don't mind, I will put you in English, but you are quite right to answer in French if you want. In your last slide, there was a note that the defense minister of Peru in August and September of this year made a trip on the three of the major builders of fighters, Dassault, Saab, and Lockheed Martin, in order to acquire 24 fighter planes. That has something to do, and is assumed that is integrated in this army race that everyone are made now because of the crisis of NATO and Trump and the war of Ukraine, or is it normal in the modernization of the Air Force of Peru? Do you know, they assume this is an extraordinary step, or is the normal step in their strategy of Air Force? Thank you.
I apologize if my English is not that much, but no, but you asked in English. I can do it. So I think it's Peru is not able to have doesn't have, better said, his own like technology. So every time he needs to modernize or he wants to change, he has to buy to another country. I don't know actually if the war between Ukraine and Russia has effects. So for this point, I don't know, but it's like normal process to have this concurrence between different other countries to buy new and to renew the float. So I don't know if it's like just because they were old. I just know that, for instance, from Russia and Italia, it was before it was the very big planes to go to place with a lot of merchandise. One was first Russia, and the modern one was Italy. So I think it's more like what is adapted to where we have to go, or how much it weighs, or how much it can lift, and obviously how much it costs. I don't know then if it's like totally transparent.
Totally transparent.
But yes, at least there were three some days ago till in the competition.
Thank you so much. We have still 3 minutes if someone else wants to do some comment or ask some question to our speakers. If not, if the organization whom I would like to thank for inviting us, receiving us, and organizing all this and put all this together, if you authorize me, I will end the panel, and I would like to ask for a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you very much. Let's go to a short coffee break, 15 minutes coffee break.